Hey guys, it's Betty from BakerBettie.com and welcome back to another video. Now today I wanted to try something a little bit different, a little more casual, and I wanted to sit down with you today and talk to you about a topic that I get questions about all of the time, and that is the topic of yeast. I feel like 9 times out of 10 when I ask my readers what thing intimidates them the most about baking, they tell me that it is yeast. And I'm a huge believer that arming ourselves with knowledge is the key to making something feel less intimidating and to feel really confident with it. So I actually asked on Instagram to ask me questions that you had about yeast, and I wrote all of them down here. And I also added a few questions that I get all of the time from my readers. Now, if you aren't already following me on social media, you should follow me at Baker Bettie on Instagram and on Facebook. I do a lot of more personal content over there, and we have a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and dive into the questions. I have my coffee here. I'm just gonna sit here in my kitchen and answer these questions. And we're gonna dive into what yeast is, how yeast works in baking, and how we can make sure that yeast is going to be successful in our recipes. Okay, so the first question is, what is yeast? Now, it's important to know that yeast is a living organism. It's actually a fungus, and it is quite literally all around us all the time. So yeast is floating through the air, it is living in the food that we eat, and it's also on our skin and in our bodies. So it's quite literally everywhere. But when we think about yeast and how it works in baking, yeast is going to feed on the sugars and starches found in our bread dough. And as it feeds, it creates carbon dioxide gas and alcohol. Now that carbon dioxide gas is going to make our bread dough rise, and the alcohol is going to help flavor our bread. So that's how yeast works in a nutshell for baking, and we'll get into a little more details as we go through the questions. So the next question is, what is the difference between dry yeast, fresh yeast, and natural yeast? This is a great question because these are the 3 forms of yeast that you are going to see in baking. So dry yeast is the most common type of yeast you'll see in baking, and it's typically sold in these little packages like this. These are 7-gram packages, but it's also sold in larger jars and also 1-pound blocks. Now, dry yeast comes in 2 forms. It comes in active dry yeast, and it also comes in quick rise yeast, which is also known as instant yeast. Now, these 2 types of yeast are both in a dormant state. So yeast needs 2 things to thrive. It needs moisture and it needs a food source. So dried yeast has had both of those things removed from it. It has been dried out, so it has essentially been put asleep, and it makes it shelf stable, so it doesn't need to be refrigerated when it's not opened, and it lasts for much longer in that state. Now, the second type of yeast is what is known as fresh yeast or cake yeast. And this is yeast that is in an awake state because there is moisture present in it. Now, this means that this also needs to be refrigerated, and it has a much shorter shelf life than the dried yeast. So it tends to be a little harder to find. It is usually found in the refrigerated section near the butter, egg, sour cream, kind of in that section in an American market, at least. It might be different in other countries. But a lot of grocery stores don't carry it any longer because it does have such a short shelf life. Now, in order to use your fresh cake yeast, you just want to crumble it up, and you can mix it in the dry ingredients of the recipe, or you can dissolve it in the liquid for the recipe. Now, the third type of yeast that you can use in baking is what is called natural yeast, and you might hear this referred to as a sourdough starter. So this is my sourdough starter. Her name is Millie, and I keep her in a jar on my counter. You can see maybe in there a little bit. I'll show you an up-close picture of it. But I created this culture just by combining water and flour together every day over a period of time. Each day you discard some of that mixture and you add fresh flour and water. Now what happens as you do this process of combining flour and water and letting it sit and adding more flour and water is there are natural yeast cells occurring in the flour as well as some good bacteria in the flour. Now, when those are hydrated and allowed to sit out, they're going to start fermenting. And as you keep adding more fresh flour and water, that community of bacteria and yeast gets stronger and more active. And you can use this instead of the dried yeast or the fresh cake yeast to leaven bread. And this is known as sourdough. Okay, the next question is, when a recipe says 1 package of yeast, what does that mean? Is it just 1 packet or the entire strip? So when you buy yeast in these individual packets, it usually comes in a strip of 3, and each little package in this strip of 3 is 7 grams. So when a recipe calls for 1 package of yeast, it's referring to just one of these 3 packages. You don't want to use the entire strip. You're just using 1 7-gram package. And that is very typical in a yeast bread recipe for it to call for 1 package. Okay, the next question is, how do you substitute active dry yeast for instant yeast? And when should you not substitute the two? So active dry yeast and instant yeast or rapid rise yeast can all be substituted for each other in most any recipe. You can just do a 1-for-1 substitution. Now the difference between active dry yeast and instant yeast is their rate of activity. So active dry yeast is going to take a little bit longer for your bread dough to rise, and instant yeast is going to work much quicker. Now, there are benefits to both. In baking with yeast, time is just as much an ingredient as the other ingredients in the recipe. So working with active dry yeast is going to take a little bit longer for your bread to get going, but it tends to result in a final baked good that has a little more flavor because more time is going to equal more flavor. Now the quick rise yeast is going to get your bread going a little more quickly, but it might have just a little bit less flavor because it doesn't have as much time to ferment. Now as far as when you might not want to substitute the two, I typically don't recommend using a quick rise yeast or rapid rise yeast if you are going to proof your shaped dough overnight in the refrigerator. And that's just because your dough could overproof. So if you are gonna proof your shaped dough in the refrigerator overnight, I would definitely suggest sticking with the active dry yeast. Okay, the next question is, what is the measurement difference between a jar of yeast and a package of yeast? So these packages that I showed you before are 7 grams each. Each little individual package on the strip is 7 grams. And if you convert that to a volume measurement, it is going to be 2 1/4 teaspoons. So if you do buy jars of yeast, which are typically sold in about 4-ounce jars, or if you do buy a 1-pound block of yeast, you can substitute a package of yeast with 2 1/4 teaspoons. So if your recipe calls for 1 package of yeast and you do have a larger quantity, just use 2 1/4 teaspoons in place of that. Or if you do have a kitchen scale, you can measure out 7 grams. The next question is, some recipes give a specific temperature for the water and some say lukewarm. Which is best? So this is a really great question because the number one thing that will kill your yeast is temperatures that are too hot. So yeast is going to begin dying around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And a lot of times a recipe is going to specify a specific temperature because this ensures that the liquid is warm enough that it's really going to get your yeast active and moving, but that it's not too hot that it will kill it. Now, sometimes recipes will just say lukewarm, and that's just because possibly the recipe writer doesn't have a thermometer, or it's assuming that maybe the reader doesn't have a thermometer. And this just ensures that you're not using temperature that's hot. You want to use temperatures that are warm. So you want your water to feel warm to the touch. You definitely don't want it to feel hot for you. If it's too hot for you to touch, it's definitely too hot for your yeast. And you want to use typically temperatures around 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, if your temperatures are much cooler than that, your yeast is still going to wake up. It will still become active, but it's just going to move a little slower. So cooler temperatures slow yeast down, warmer temperatures are going to speed yeast up, and then too hot is going to start killing the yeast. Okay, the next question is, I always kill my yeast. What am I doing wrong? So I think we addressed this a little bit in the last question, that really make sure that the temperature of your liquid is not too hot. But I also think that sometimes our yeast is maybe just moving a little slower than we will like, and then we think that it might be dead. So you want to make sure that the room temperature where you are letting your dough rise is warm. So if your room temperature is very cool, you want to try to find a warmer spot in your kitchen. Sometimes in the microwave or on top of the refrigerator, sometimes will be a little bit warmer. So a lot of times it's just that our yeast is moving a little too slowly, but just make sure that your temperatures are not too hot. You don't want to reach 140 degrees with your liquids. If you don't have a kitchen thermometer, I would really recommend getting one. They are not expensive, and that's going to really ensure that your yeast does not die from liquids that are too hot. The next question is, what is proofing your yeast and when should I do it? So the process of proofing your yeast is when you pour dried yeast into liquid to hydrate it, and you add a pinch of sugar. Now that liquid is going to wake the yeast up, and the sugar is going to give the yeast a food source to start feeding on. Now, as this starts occurring, you will start seeing the mixture bubble up quite a lot, and that's just an insurance policy for you to make sure that your yeast is alive and make sure that your yeast isn't old. If you're a little worried about it, it's really good to proof your yeast before adding it into your bread dough. And also, it can just be a way to give your yeast a little bit of a jump start so that it's really, really nice and active when it goes into the dough. It can get the dough going just a little quicker. Now, if you do want to try proofing your yeast for your recipe, you want to use about a half a cup of the liquid from the recipe with 1 package of the dried yeast. And you're going to warm this to just about 110 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're going to mix that half cup of warm liquid with your package of yeast and a pinch of sugar, and you just want to let that sit for about 5 to 10 minutes until it starts foaming up. And then you do want to immediately put that into your recipe. Now, if you don't see it foaming up at all, that's an indication that your yeast is old or inactive, and you definitely want to get some new yeast. So this question is, can I use more yeast to make my dough rise faster? So the technical answer to this question is yes, but I would highly advise against doing so. If you add more yeast into your recipe, it's likely that your dough is going to rise much faster, but it can overdevelop your gluten structure, it can overproof your dough, and it can just lead to results that are not desirable. So I would definitely recommend sticking to the amount of yeast listed in your recipe, and don't try to rush the process. Yeast bread does take time, and that's just part of the process, so you definitely just don't want to rush it. Okay, so the last question is, what is the best way to store yeast? Now, dried yeast can be stored at room temperature as long as it is unopened, and just make sure you're not putting it somewhere very warm, like near your oven. And once that dried yeast has been opened, you do want to remove it to your refrigerator or freezer for storage, and make sure it is in an airtight container. Now, the fresh yeast does need to be stored in the refrigerator at all times. It is highly perishable, and it really only has about a 2-week shelf life. Now, fresh yeast does not do well in the freezer. It doesn't usually function very well after it has been defrosted, so I definitely don't recommend storing it in the freezer. Now, I really hope you found this video informative and enjoyable, and if you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up. Now, if there are any other questions you have about yeast that I didn't tackle in this video, go ahead and ask those in the comment section. I would be happy to answer them. And if you have any other topics or questions that you'd like for me to answer in a Ask Baker Bettie video, go ahead and also leave those in the comment section and I will try to work those in. Now, I will be back in just a few days with another baking tutorial for you, and this recipe is going to use yeast. So everything we learned today is going to be really useful in this recipe, and I will see you guys then. Bye.